Managing ADHD and adrenal insufficiency at the same time creates a biological paradox where your brain is desperate for stimulation, but your body is physically incapable of sustaining it. The medical system treats these as two separate problems, one neurologist, one endocrinologist, but inside the person, they are colliding every single minute. And what happens when the very strategies you use to regulate your neurodivergent mind actively deplete the cortisol your body can't produce?
That collision is exactly where so many people find themselves just completely stuck. Because if you think about how we typically manage ADHD, right? It's all about finding ways to increase dopamine, harness adrenaline, create urgency to initiate tasks. You use stress or excitement to push through the executive dysfunction. But if you have adrenal insufficiency, if you have Addison's disease or secondary AI, your body literally cannot manufacture the stress hormone, cortisol, required to survive that push. So you end up in this agonizing loop where the mental effort required to just organize your day ends up draining your physiological battery to zero.
It's a structural problem. You're demanding fuel from a tank that has a hole in it.
Exactly, and it's a hole that most people, even doctors, don't fully comprehend when they are looking at the behavioral output. When I was reading the piece from My Adrenal Life about this exact intersection, the thing that struck me most was how they described it as being pulled in two different directions at once. On one side, you have this intense mental effort to stay organized and regulated, which is already a heavy lift for a neurodivergent brain. On the other side, there's this physical reality of a body that just doesn't have the metabolic stability to keep up. It's not just feeling tired, it's a cellular lack of capacity.
The distinction between typical fatigue and an adrenal wall.
Right. And we need to be really specific about what that wall feels like. Fatigue is what happens when you've done a lot of work and you need rest. The adrenal wall is a sudden, catastrophic drop in capacity. It's when sensory overload or decision-making stops being just a mental strain and becomes a physical weight. You actually feel it in your limbs. Your blood pressure might drop, your brain gets incredibly foggy, and your body is essentially signaling that it cannot sustain consciousness or upright posture at the current rate of demand. And if you're neurodivergent, your threshold for reaching that state is already altered because of how much more energy your brain uses just to filter the world.
Because the sensory filtering is manual.
Exactly. For a neurotypical person, filtering out the hum of a refrigerator or the fluorescent lights overhead happens automatically. It doesn't cost them anything. For someone with ADHD, filtering that takes active metabolic energy. Now add adrenal insufficiency to that. Cortisol plays a huge role in attention and alertness. According to research published in the journal Endocrine Reviews, cortisol deficiency has a direct, profound effect on cognitive processes, specifically impairing attention and executive function. So you already have an ADHD brain that struggles with executive function, and now you have a physiological deficit of the exact hormone needed to support that function.
So the baseline is already compromised on two fronts.
Yes, and the symptoms mimic each other so closely that it becomes impossible to untangle. Are you experiencing brain fog because your ADHD meds were off, or because your cortisol is dangerously low? Are you struggling to initiate a task because of executive dysfunction? Or is your body physically fatigued because your cells don't have enough glucocorticoids to produce energy? It creates this incredible layer of frustration.
It forces you to become an active manager of your own biology.
And the problem is, the tools you're given to manage it often fail. The My Adrenal Life article points this out beautifully. Medication responses feel inconsistent. You take your ADHD stimulant one day and it works perfectly. You take it the next day and it does absolutely nothing, or worse, it makes you feel jittery and exhausted. And that inconsistency makes people feel like they are doing something wrong, when in reality, it's just that the underlying physiological state, the cortisol level, has shifted.
Let's pause there.
I don't know, that feels too clean to me. The idea that you can just map the stimulant inconsistency entirely onto cortisol levels. Aren't stimulants notoriously inconsistent for ADHD folks anyway, just based on sleep, diet, or hormone cycles?
That's a really fair pushback. Yes, stimulants are incredibly temperamental. We know that things like estrogen drops during a menstrual cycle can make ADHD meds feel like sugar pills. But when you introduce adrenal insufficiency, you're not just dealing with the normal fluctuations of dopamine and norepinephrine, you're dealing with a compromised HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is the system that regulates our stress response. In someone with adrenal insufficiency, the adrenal glands are either destroyed, like in Addison's disease, or not getting the signal to produce cortisol, like in secondary AI. Stimulants work by increasing sympathetic nervous system activity. They ask the body to go into a mild state of go. In a healthy body, that go signal is supported by a subtle release of cortisol to mobilize glucose for the brain to use.
Ah, so the stimulant makes the demand, but the cortisol isn't there to pay the bill.
Exactly. It's writing a check your body literally cannot cash. If your basal cortisol is too low that day, the stimulant might just drain whatever tiny reserves you have left, pushing you closer to an adrenal crash. Or because cortisol is required for the proper function of certain neurotransmitter receptors, the dopamine might not even bind effectively. That's why the My Adrenal Life piece emphasizes that typical ADHD strategies don't always land the way they should. The physiological foundation is unstable.
Which means standard medical advice might actually be harmful.
It absolutely can be. If a psychiatrist doesn't understand adrenal insufficiency, they might just keep increasing the dose of the stimulant, thinking the ADHD is just severe. But more stimulant without adequate cortisol coverage is just whipping a tired horse. It accelerates burnout. And this burnout follows what the article calls a push-crash pattern. You have a good hour, you hyperfocus, you use up all your energy, and then your body just pulls the plug. You crash disproportionately hard.
Because the hyperfocus itself is a stressor.
Exactly. Hyperfocus feels good mentally, but physiologically, it's a high-demand state. Your brain is consuming massive amounts of glucose and oxygen. If you can't dynamically adjust your cortisol to match that demand, you deplete yourself rapidly. And this brings us to sensory overload, which is another massive overlap. For an ADHD or autistic brain, a busy grocery store is an assault of data. Bright lights, overlapping conversations, the hum of the freezers. The brain perceives this as a stressor.
And the body tries to mount a stress response.
Yes, but it can't. The HPA axis is broken, so the sensory overload doesn't just result in mental overwhelm, it results in rapid physical depletion. The body is essentially saying, we are under attack, we need to adapt, but the chemical messenger of adaptation, cortisol, is missing. So you get this profound physical exhaustion. You might start shaking, get dizzy, or completely lose the ability to speak or process information. It's a physiological system failure, triggered by a neurological input.
That completely reframes how we have to look at capacity.
It really does. It forces us to stop looking at capacity as a measure of willpower or motivation. This is something caregivers and partners really struggle to grasp. They see the person with ADHD hyper-focusing on a hobby for 3 hours on Sunday, but then unable to empty the dishwasher on Sunday. The outside assumption is often, well, you can do it when it's something you care about. But that's a fundamental misunderstanding of how the neurodivergent brain and the adrenal system interact.
Wait, does that actually hold? Because even neurotypical people have more energy for things they enjoy. Isn't it naturally harder to rally for the dishwasher than for a hobby, regardless of cortisol?
It is, but the scale of the drop-off is what's different here. For a neurotypical person, avoiding the dishwasher is usually about preference or mild fatigue. For someone with this overlap, the 3 hours of hyperfocus on Saturday might have literally depleted their cellular energy reserves for the next 48 hours.
Right.
The lack of cortisol means they have no buffer. So on Sunday, it's not that they don't want to empty the dishwasher, it's that their body is in a state of clinical depletion. The inconsistency isn't a character flaw. It's a symptom of a rigid physiological limit being reached.
The variability is the symptom.
Yes, the variability is part of how the body protects itself. When multiple systems are involved, neurological and endocrine, the body is constantly trying to triage energy. If there isn't enough to go around, it starts shutting down non-essential functions. Sometimes that means executive function goes offline. You literally cannot sequence the steps required to empty the dishwasher. You stare at it, and it just looks like a wall of impossible geometry.
So how do you actually operate in a system that wasn't designed for this?
You have to start radically validating your own experience. The My Adrenal Life article has this line, "You are allowed to adapt differently." I think that's the core of it. If a standard productivity hack like the Pomodoro technique or time blocking feels unsustainable, that is meaningful data. It's not a sign you aren't trying hard enough. It's a sign that your specific neuroendocrine setup cannot handle that structure.
It requires abandoning the moral weight we attach to productivity.
Exactly. You have to shift from thinking about motivation to thinking strictly about capacity. What is my physical capacity today? What is my cognitive capacity? And recognizing that those two things might be entirely mismatched. You might have the mental desire to write a novel, but your body needs to lie flat in a dark room. You have to honor the limiting factor, which is almost always the physical body when adrenal insufficiency is in the mix. Pacing becomes less about time management and more about metabolic survival.
That's a heavy thing to carry.
There's something almost sad about it, honestly. Realizing that your brain wants to engage with the world at 100 miles an hour, but your body is enforcing a speed limit of 10. It requires a massive grieving process. But on the other side of that grief is a really profound self-knowledge. You start noticing the subtle signals. You realize that a specific type of fluorescent lighting doesn't just annoy you, it actually drains your physical energy for the next day. You stop fighting your biology and start accommodating it.
You stop trying to fix the engine and learn how to drive the car you actually have.
Exactly. And for anyone listening who feels seen by this, who feels that specific exhaustion of managing both, you are absolutely not alone. Your experience doesn't have to fit neatly into a medical textbook to be valid. You are allowed to move at a pace that keeps you safe.
If this conversation resonated with you, there is a lot more depth to explore. You can read the full article we discussed today in the My Adrenal Life Facebook group. Go find it, read it, and share it with the people in your life who need to understand what this actually looks like.